devotional hymn is number 525, The Church's One Foundation.
And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me, that is my petition, and the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word, save the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The second reading is taken from the book of James. Are any among you suffering? They should pray. Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise. Are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. The prayer of the faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up, and anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven. Therefore confess your sins to one another, and pray for one another, so that you may be healed. The prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective. Elijah was a human being just like us, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and a year the earth yielded its harvest. My brothers and sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and is brought back to another, you should know that whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save the sinner's soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. The word of the Lord.
Thanks.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, according to St. Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able soon afterwards to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will be no means lose the reward. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is far better for you to enter like maimed than to have 2 hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter the life lane than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where the word never dies and the fire is never quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves, and be at peace with one another. This is the gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Lord, may thy presence seen, may artists blessing be. Give us of pure and lowly heart, a temple fit for thee.
And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to say again what a privilege and a pleasure it is to have the Masons with us this morning and their partners who have accompanied them. We do appreciate it, just as I know the congregation those many years ago appreciated the work of the Masons at the construction of this place. If I had been a little bit more on the ball and looked at the readings far enough ahead of time to let Ann know, I would have switched that first reading out, I think. I'm not sure. It was quite one that's as celebratory if we should have been, particularly because I want to touch on another old passage, testimony, or test from the Old Testament to set up where I'm going this morning. Most of us, I suspect, are familiar somewhat with the story of Moses and the journey of the Israelites in the wilderness. But if you recall, there's a point in time when, well, they're still out there wandering and waiting, that Moses takes a group of the elders aside to receive the Spirit of God. This is part of the ordination, as it were, of the elders and their sanctification. But there were two of them who didn't go out with Moses. They stayed back in the camp. And as the Spirit rested upon the elders and they began to prophesy, the two that were back in the camp also had the Spirit come upon them. And they began to prophesy. This was the response of Joshua, son of Nun, who was actually becomes Moses, the one who follows Moses as the leader. One of the men came to Joshua and said, these two guys are prophesying. So Joshua, son of Nun, assistant to Moses, one of his chosen men, said, "My Lord Moses, stop them." He didn't like the idea that these guys who hadn't been part of the crowd had gone out. And Moses said to him, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and the Lord would put his Spirit upon them." We hear this morning John saying to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." I'm sure we've seen it in our own lives as well, and certainly we see it often in the lives of the church and many other organizations. We get jealous of our prerogatives. We don't like it when we think somebody else is impinging on what we believe is our responsibility, our area of authority. Ironically, in terms of John calling out, we saw someone casting out demons. Last week, the passage right before this, we hear that the disciples could not cast out a demon and asked Jesus why. Because you need prayer for that, he's told. But this idea that somehow somebody else is doing it is disturbing to John because of their own sense. Jesus' response though is that you don't stop them, because anyone who does a deed of power in my name will not afterwards be able to speak evil of me, because whoever is not against us is for us. And again, ironically, we do know that the disciples begin to turn at the end. But this idea that someone who can do a deed of power, someone who can speak in Jesus' name, cannot actually turn against them. At that point, he is for them. And indeed, the disciples are reminded, you're going to need the help of other people. There's no way you can do it all by yourself. Even someone who gives you as simple a thing as a glass of water, because you're working in my name, that glass of water is enough to assure them of God's blessing. The smallest thing, help us in the smallest ways. And then there's this whole passage about stumbling blocks. Whatever you do to prevent someone from coming forward as they try to stop the children from coming forward could have serious ramifications for you, the one who is being the stumbling block. Chad Myers points out that this is interesting in that at that point in time, if you were to betray the cause, if you were to betray the nation, execution is the normal response. I mean, we still see that in places today. If you're a traitor, certainly during a time of war in many places, you can be put to death. So betraying the cause would be certainly result in execution. But Jesus doesn't actually say that. If you're going to do something that causes somebody else to stumble, if you're going to, in that effect, betray the cause, if your hand is causing you to stumble, cut off the hand, but make sure you can still stay part of us. If you have to cut off your foot, if you have to pluck out the eye, whatever's causing you to stumble, whatever's being an impediment to your being a follower, you need to cut it out and put it aside, because it's more important to be able to enter into the kingdom of God than to remain whole physically. That's an interesting point in that you wouldn't be allowed into the temple to worship if you were deformed. Physical, you had to be perfect to go in, so those with physical deformities were on the outs, much like the sick and everything else. But it's the fact that I think Jesus is saying we never want to be completely cut off. There's always a hope of reconciliation. There's always the chance to bring people back in. But we need to be aware of being our own stumbling blocks. One of the things, of course, is we can't assume to know who God thinks belongs and who doesn't. That's part of our problem. The disciples are saying, well, the children in that time were seen more as possessions and not even very useful ones. Slaves had more value because they could do stuff. Children, until they grow up to an age where they are worthwhile in an economic sense, had no value. So therefore, what business do they have coming forward? And yet Jesus is saying, no, these little ones have tremendous value in God's eyes. We hear that you need to be like these if you want to be in the kingdom with our God. We can never assume that we know who belongs on the outside and who belongs on the inside. As soon as we begin to make those assumptions, we're actually at risk of putting ourselves on the outside, of taking ourselves away. And we do that both as individuals, and we can do it as a church, as an institution. Back in the early 90s, I attended a conference, Bread Not Stones, and its whole focus was about sexual abuse in the church. One of the keynote speakers was our primate then, Michael Piers, and I had the privilege of sitting at a table with some women from Kingston. This was a number of years after the tragedy, the tragic circumstances at the cathedral there, where the choir master had abused some of the boys in his care. And it was heart-rending stories. But what was most notable, telling for me, was that one of the mothers that was there, as bad as the circumstances of what happened to her son was, the stumbling block to her from being reconciled back to the church, hopefully not to God, was not what had happened to her son, but the church's response. At that point in time, they were still listening to the lawyers. And it wasn't until the new bishop, Peter Mason, now retired, but it was a number of years later when he became bishop, and one of his first acts was to stand on the steps of the cathedral and, against the advice of the lawyers, issue that public apology, striving to remove that stumbling block that was separating God's church from God's people. We need to be really aware of the things we do that are barriers to those who try to come to the church. Sometimes it's our traditions, sometimes it's our doctrines, sometimes it's our own attitudes. Would never happen here, certainly not now, but you know, we all hear the stories of a visitor coming to church and then having a regular member come in and say, "You're in my pew." That kind of things are barriers to those that we want to bring in. There is a way to counter it, though. There is a way to counter it. How many of you have ever had a point in your life when you think of a song that was your signature song? I was in Edmonton in the summer of 77. There's a fellow I was living in a boarding house with, and for us it was, Billy Joel's "Only the Good Die Young." That was certainly, I can't not hear that song and think of that time. I won't tell you that the song that Hillary and I sort of had thought of as our signature song while we were dating. But it's incredibly saccharine. But all of us can think about times in our life when a particular song sort of identifies what was about our life was about at that time. Well, Alan Cohen writes about a tribe in Africa that actually embodies that notion. When a woman is pregnant, as she's approaching the time to give birth, she goes off into the wilderness, and in a time of meditation and reflection, a song comes to her. And that is the child's song. And when she goes back into the village, she teaches the song to the rest of the community. So when the child's born, the community gathers and sings the song. When the child goes through the rite that leads them into adulthood, be it man or woman, the community sings the song. At death, the community sings the song. But there is another point in life when the song can be sung. If the individual does something that cuts them off from the community, some sort of crime or something happens, but they separate themselves from the community because of their actions, the community gathers and sings the song, reminding them that they are not isolated, that no matter what they do, they are loved and part of the community. So rather than retribution or punishment, the community enfolds the people, the individual, and sings that song to remind them of who they are, whose they are, and where they belong. Jesus said we are to be like salt. Now, the salt and fire sounds like a funny term for us, but sacrifices, if you read back into the Old Testament, how the sacrifices were to be done, a perfect beast of whatever description is brought forward, and it's slaughtered, and then it's sprinkled with salt as part of the purifying ritual, and then it's burned. Except more often than not, it's more cooked because then the meat is shared. But it's that fire and salt as part of the purifying ritual. So we are to be salted and tested in fire and purified. And that's part of showing that we are worthy of God's love. We are salted. And when we encounter difficulties, the salt that we need to bring to it is God's love. When we encounter somebody who seems to be a stumbling block to us or to the church, we need to take that salt to surround them with God's love and allow them into our presence. And sometimes it allows us back into the church as well. When we ensure that we encounter those that we encounter with God's love in our hearts, then they're part of our community no matter what else is going on. No matter what else we may be tempted to do to set them aside because, like John, we're concerned that they're not following us. God's love is the way to make sure that we are open to them and let them in. It's why this place was built that 150 years ago, to bring God's love to the people in this community. At least our particular Anglican flavor of that love. But it's also why the churches in this community work so well together when they do. It's recognizing that we're all grounded in that love. Last night we had that wonderful concert that I suspect many of you didn't have the chance to listen, but it was wonderful both because of the music, but also the fact that as they went through it, it involved choir members from all the different churches in the community. It's that ability to work together, to recognize that we share that salt of love in common, that shows that we are all following the same master, the same great Mason that teaches us how to build together, to live together, and to love together. And for that we give thanks this day and always.
Brothers and sisters, draw near, praise Him in glad adoration. Praise to the Lord, who o'er all things so wondrously reigneth, shelters the under His wings, His openly sustaineth.
Thank you.